Welcome to Discussion. If you're new to the channel, Discussion is where we delve into the games that we cover in Storytime and talk about what makes them tick. Now, Twitch Plays Pokemon is a little different from the kind of thing I normally cover, but that actually opens up a lot of fun stuff to talk about. Normally when I'm talking about a game like Kingdom Hearts, I'm telling you the story based on the actual events of the game, sticking to the canon, which means whatever's officially established in the story. Twitch Plays Pokemon was unique because the actual game wasn't the most interesting part. A unique culture and mythology came up around it, and it introduces our topic for today, interpretation. So what do I mean by interpretation? You can make a list of all the notable events of the Pokemon run, and in fact I always had one open while writing the episodes. But having thousands of people play the same game of Pokemon led to all sorts of hilarious and ridiculous things, like Red opening the menu and looking at the same item over and over for no reason. Though in the context of the game it was just the result of the same button presses coming in, as humans were constantly assigning meaning to things, so people began to build a larger story around the game to explain what was going on. It resulted in this amazing organic culture and meta story that arose from the chaos of the game. Everyone knows the story of Pokemon Red if they've played it, but this was something wholly unique. We were interpreting the events of the game and giving them a new context. And my version of the story interpreted that mythology and used it in different ways. And that's why I love Twitch Plays Pokemon. 100 people could tell the same story, and they would each be markedly different based on what elements people emphasized or changed to see what they thought was important. For example, a very popular interpretation of why Red moves around randomly is that he's crazy and he's hearing voices in his head. There's a lot of amazing art and comics that came from that idea, and each person has their own take on it. My story ended up explaining the random movement by saying that the Helix fossil was telling Red where to go, emphasizing that it didn't make sense but that it ultimately served a purpose. I did this because I wanted my story to highlight the battle between Anarchy and Democracy, a dynamic between the players that totally changed the way we saw in-game events. Anarchy was the way the game started, taking whatever inputs came in and creating the chaos that made the stream famous. Democracy was a system where the game would use the most popular command during a 20-second period. A lot of people liked one more than the other, and for many it revealed what it was that they actually liked about the stream to begin with. Some people liked the chaos and unpredictability, and didn't care about progress or doing what made the most sense. Others felt like the fun was in cooperating towards a single goal, working together to play efficiently. Anarchy supporters saw Democracy as boring and soulless, while Democracy players felt that Anarchy was counterproductive and frustrating to watch. These concepts often blend into how people portrayed the events and characters, and this is what I brought into the story with the Helix. Now, as I said before, the things that people bring in and leave out of an interpretive story reflect the kind of story they want to tell. I was a firm supporter of Anarchy, so my story represented that. However, what I really wanted to explore was the conflict between the two sides, which is why we ended up with the Helix on one side giving Red nonsensical guidance, and Eevee on the other trying to get him to go on a path of progress and order. Now, in terms of the actual game, I don't think either side is right, it's all just preference. But that wouldn't have been quite as fun, so I picked up on Eevee's reputation as the false prophet and turned him into a villain. This is where things get a little more complicated. Eevee was called the false prophet because it came to the team and filled a spot that everyone assumed Lapras would get, so they could use Surf and not have to go to the PC too much, which, as we know, tended to be fairly disastrous. The obvious solution was to get a Water Stone to make Vaporeon, but we bought a Fire Stone instead. Shortly after this, we released our starter and our beloved Rattata Jay Leno. Eevee was blamed and thus got its reputation. In my story, Eevee and later Flareon were outright evil, trying to kill Red when he chose Anarchy. When he's defeated, it's a happy moment, though I did try to show that Red was sad as well. So we have the Helix leading Red on a difficult but ultimately worthwhile path, and Flareon trying to force him into a more progressive but pragmatic one. Now, let's imagine that same storyline told from the perspective of someone who is supporting Democracy. In that story, the Helix drives Red crazy and sends him all over trying to lead him on a path to destruction. Eevee joins the team and tries to save him, but is destroyed in the process. Eevee goes from being a villain to a tragic hero, and the flavor of the story changes completely. And that's only two examples. There's any number of ways you could go. Someone in the comments the other day suggested that maybe the Firestone was actually the evil one, and Eevee got corrupted under its influence. That again changes the dynamic in the way that the same basic events of Eevee joining the team and then being released are portrayed. The idea of interpretation, telling the same story in different ways, is of course nothing new. Humans have been telling stories that way since, well, the time we were able to tell stories at all. For a long time, all stories were told orally, because we simply hadn't invented writing yet. This is called the oral tradition, and it results in a single story being told in many different ways, depending on who's telling it, who they're telling it to, and what their purpose is. It wasn't until later in our history that stories started to take a concrete form, to be told the same way every time. The advent of writing was what made stories static, the way we think of them now, though many stories still get eternally retold in different forms. There are plenty of examples of this. The Grimm fairy tales were just collections of stories that had been told for generations, but because they were put down in writing, a lot of the elements that they changed or added became staples of how we know them today. But even so, there's still an incredible amount of variations in these stories. How many different renditions of Little Red Riding Hood have you seen? How many stories use the structure of Romeo and Juliet or The Wizard of Oz but change things around? This idea is what makes stories so universal. They had infinite possibilities to suit an infinite number of purposes. If you tell your version of the story of Twitch Plays Pokemon, it's going to be similar to mine in some ways and different in others. And I think that's pretty awesome. So that's all for Twitch Plays Pokemon Red. I cannot thank you enough for watching. My viewer count has more than tripled during this series, and I've gotten so many wonderful comments I'm honestly blown away. Hopefully I can continue to tell you guys some great stories, so please stay tuned. If you guys want to keep up with Storytime, you can subscribe on YouTube or follow me on Tumblr, where I blog about new episodes and channel updates and post images from the episodes. Thanks again, and see you soon.